Hey guys, welcome to my channel. My name is Michael. In this video, I'm going to radically expand on the brief setup overview I did at the end of my last video. As the title suggests, my music production setup is based on the iPad Pro. The main idea behind the inclusion of this device in my original Digitakt and Digitone setup is to dramatically expand its power and functionality while simultaneously using these devices to greatly augment the appeal of the iPad Pro, particularly when it comes to sequencing sound sources originating from the iPad directly. I will cover everything from scratch, and I'm going to give you in-depth explanations on how this custom setup works. This is going to be a presentation focusing on technical stuff, but I will still give you some context along the way so that you can understand the logic behind the design decisions I made for this custom setup. As I said in my last video, one of the main goals behind the content I'm creating on this channel is to provide key information to help and empower people so that they can ultimately make better decisions in the context of their music exploration journey. A colossal amount of research went into gathering all this information over the last 9 months. Hopefully, putting all this information in one place and articulating it in a structured manner will be helpful and will potentially inspire people to take a chance with a different approach for their music making setup. First things first, I'll go over the detailed list of all the hardware I use for this setup. Full transparency, going over this is going to take a while, but it's highly relevant for people who are serious about potentially putting together a similar setup. Even though it's not my preference, I will also deliver information throughout this video at a relatively fast pace in order to keep the length of the video under control. If you feel like this upcoming segment is maybe not super appropriate for you, if you're just slightly curious about this setup and have limited time, timestamps are available for this video, so feel free to skip to the next section. Even though I don't recommend skipping this section because odds are I will refer to that information frequently throughout the video, you can always come back to that segment if your interest intensifies, as what I'm about to describe is going to be rather dry and time-consuming, while also being potentially very useful for some. So in this first major segment of the video, I will go over the actual list of what I use. First, let's start with the elephant in the room. I use the iPad Pro 11-inch 2022, which is the model that has an M2 processor. As this is the centerpiece of my setup, I will explain exactly why I chose this device, because there's a lot of potential for making a bad decision if you're considering buying an iPad for the purpose of making music, but aren't fully aware of everything that's implied with that decision. To begin, that iPad uses an M2 Apple Silicon CPU with 8 cores, including 4 performance cores, which are the only types of cores that are used in AUM, according to what the AUM app reports in real time. It has 128 gigs of internal storage. It only has Wi-Fi connectivity. And lastly, a very important detail to consider is that a USB-C 4.0/Thunderbolt 4 port is the only physical connection point of the device, and this connectivity specification is reserved for Pro Series iPads as opposed to Air Series, for example. I chose this iPad model specifically because the M series Apple Silicon processors represent a major technological breakthrough, specifically on the thermal efficiency front, and the only way to gain access to an M chip on an iPad, as well as 120Hz refresh rate touchscreen is to get a Pro Series iPad. On a side note, for music production, an M2 chip is absolutely not overkill once you become aware of the potential for overheating and care about maintaining low latency. Despite its price, the 11-inch iPad Pro at the time represented by far the best value in the context of music production, especially when considering connectivity, which was a highly unusual thing to observe considering Apple's history up to that point. Unfortunately, ever since the release of the new 11-inch M4 iPad Pro, things got considerably worse from an affordability standpoint because it's no longer possible to buy a new M2 iPad Pro at a lower cost. Having access to an iPad Pro that has specifically 4 performance cores instead of 3, as well as access to features exclusive to the Pro series, now implies that the price floor of an M4 iPad Pro that would meet this criteria has now increased by roughly 60% compared to the previous M2 model. While this might sound like bad news, don't let that discourage you, because the potential of the iPad platform is in a ballpark of its own, and objectively, you would still be getting a significantly better device from a performance standpoint, even though you'd be effectively paying a massive premium for a luxury display that's not exactly relevant for this use case, even though that display is, of course, amazing. Back to the main subject, I chose the 11-inch version because its format was proportionate with the dimensions of my Elektron machines, as opposed to the 13-inch version. And so, even putting money considerations aside, I personally am convinced that the 11-inch version is more appropriate simply because of its less intrusive format. I did not need cellular connectivity because this equipment is meant to be used strictly as a piece of dedicated music hardware. And regardless of that, it's always possible to use my iPhone as a Wi-Fi hotspot for my iPad if necessary. I also choose that model because most of my music revolves around the use of synthesized sounds, which implies that the apps I would install would require very little storage space. It's also possible to connect the iPad Pro to an external storage device while benefiting from extremely fast transfer speeds, which generally speaking makes larger internal storage options essentially pointless for this use case. Lastly, I chose this specific model because it was the most efficient way to gain access to the iPad Pro platform, which unlocks access to a key and exclusive technological breakthrough component with its M-series chip, which, in my opinion, also represents the biggest technological breakthrough in Apple's history until now, even more so considering the new M4 version. By choosing the most basic iPad Pro model possible, I gained access to all the stuff I've mentioned up to this point, while also effectively bypassing what I call the Apple tax, which greatly contributed to keeping the financial pressure of the investment under control. To sum things up, no cellular data option, no extra storage options, no 13-inch model, no Apple Pencil, no Apple Care, just the most basic iPad Pro version with the intent of using it with a case in a safe home studio environment. My experience over the 8 following months also confirmed that at no point since my iPad journey began have I ever felt like I had made any compromise due to the size or the storage space option that I had chosen. This decision also made it financially easier to cover other things like apps and necessary accessories, which have all worked flawlessly for me, by the way. In case that's relevant to you, I also specifically waited until Black Friday 2023 to buy the device, as the purchase included an App Store credit of $140 Canadian, which significantly reduced the cost of my overall investment. With that said, I'm just a messenger, of course. I have no idea if that opportunity is going to happen again in 2024. So, now that the iPad's out of the way, let's move on to the other equipment included in my setup. So, The second equipment element in my setup is a combination of key USB connectivity related gear, which is needed to expand the connectivity of the iPad Pro to fit in this setup. I know firsthand how unpleasant it is to consider these kinds of expenses, but having something that is proven to work flawlessly and reliably is highly valuable, particularly in this context. I will merge the 5 components I use to take care of all that stuff in this section. The first component I chose is a high-end third-party USB-C hub, which is specifically compatible with the M2 iPad Pro. This component is absolutely crucial because of the risk of running into technical issues or even the risk of fire with low-quality equipment, considering that Apple does not manufacture a device that has the exact specs of this hub, and these specs are absolutely crucial to my setup. The exact model I use, and which I can completely vouch for, is the Uni Accessories Union Pro Plus USB-C hub. It includes a 1 gigabit per second Ethernet port, which I use to avoid Wi-Fi radiation as much as possible and to ensure a rock-stable internet and local area network connection in the context of using Ableton Link. It includes an HDMI port, which has the specificity of being able to output a video signal at a highly desirable 4K resolution with a 60 Hz refresh rate. The 60 Hz refresh rate is a very uncommon attribute for a USB hub that packs up all this connectivity, and so it inherently makes the hub significantly more expensive. I use this HDMI port to connect my iPad's video output to an external video capture USB module, which is connected to my PC, where I can then use OBS to record my iPad's video output without putting any processing load on my iPad Pro. The result of this is what you see to the right of the screen. The hub also includes SD and micro SD card readers, which I personally don't use for now. It includes 2 USB 3.0 ports with bandwidths of up to 5 gigabits per second, which I use to connect my Digitone and Digitakt to the iPad, even though they're both USB 2.0 devices. The hub also includes 1 USB 2.0 port with a bandwidth of up to 480 megabits per second, which I can optionally use to connect my Arturia KeyStep MIDI keyboard controller or a mouse if I ever need to. I don't use it on a daily basis, but obviously it's very useful still. Lastly, the hub also includes a very important USB-C port strictly dedicated to deliver power to the hub, which can use up to 100 watt. On a very important side note, the Union Pro Plus USB-C hub is the only product I found on the market which breaks away from the official USB-C specification because it relies on a fully detachable 90 centimeters USB-C male-to-male cable to connect the USB-C hub to the iPad Pro, whereas a typical USB-C hub would always have a very short cable permanently attached to the hub. The implication here is that not only is this 90 centimeters cable a game changer due to its length, considering the ergonomics and logistics of using an iPad in a hardware-based setup, because it increases the maximum distance between the iPad and the hub to the point where the hub is simply no longer in the way, which completely eliminates the numerous issues that would otherwise be encountered with every other USB-C hub, specifically in that use case. The second component I chose is a quality 2 meters USB-C power delivery cable rated for 100 watt. I chose the Uni Accessories 2 meters unlimited 100 watt USB-C to USB-C fast charging cable. The third component I chose is a power supply for my USB-C hub. I chose the Anker USB-C charger GAN2 100 watt, which I got on Amazon. The fourth component I chose is a pack of 3 USB-C adapters, including 3 variations of a male to female USB-C 90 degrees angle adapter by Tech, which I took a risk of purchasing on Amazon. My experience has proven that they work flawlessly, despite being very affordable. They're also supposedly rated for up to 240 watts and are compatible with 40 gigabits per second transfer speeds. Out of all the 3 adapter variants included in this pack, I only use the one you see installed on my iPad right now because it's by far the most unobtrusive and ergonomic of the 3, considering my use case. However, keep in mind that it's technically marginally thicker than the iPad when installed, which means that the iPad needs to be fitted with a case to add a little bit of thickness to it if you want to be able to rest the iPad flush on a surface while using this particular adapter. In my case, I use a detachable folio style accessory to put my iPad at an angle, and it's sitting on my desk, which adds some elevation to the iPad at the point of connection. And with this configuration, the issue of clearance is inherently non-existent, regardless of the thickness of my iPad. In case you're curious, the accessory I chose is an ESR Rebound 360 series case, which includes a snug protective case for the iPad and a transparent back, which is currently magnetically attached to the folio style add-on that comes with it. I also bought this on Amazon. In the event where you would want to use an iPad resting flush against a flat surface without a case, or if your iPad happens to be too thin even with a case, one of the other adapter variants provided in the 90 degrees adapter pack can be used instead, which is perfectly viable, even though not as tidy and arguably not as safe. So I can show the 2 other adapter variants that I have here. So this one, see, is the other candidate that you would use. And this third one is just not really appropriate for this use case, but it's also included if you ever need it in whatever other context. This adapter is extremely important for 2 reasons. First, because an iPad should never be left connected to a charger for long periods of time unless it's being charged or used due to the risk of degrading the battery or of potentially causing it to expand, which would obviously damage the iPad. When the device is being used heavily on a daily basis, it will end up being frequently connected and disconnected from the USB-C hub's cable, which could wear the iPad's USB-C port down. This angle adapter fits very tightly in the iPad Pro's USB-C port, and by leaving the adapter permanently attached to the iPad, this completely eliminates the risk of wearing down the iPad connection port directly. If there ever was a wear issue with the adapter or the hub's USB cable, both of these components would be easily replaceable. The second reason this component is very important is simply ergonomics. As you can see, the adapter allows the cable connection to the iPad to be completely out of the way of my left hand. So that pretty much covers that part. The 5th and last component is definitely optional, as it becomes useful mainly if you intend to record your iPad's video output externally. I personally find this capability to be very useful, so I use the Elgato HD60X capture module to take care of that, and it works very well. But keep in mind that performance and reliability comes at a cost. So now that we're done with the USB connectivity related stuff, let's move on to the third main piece of equipment of my setup. I use the Elektron Digitakt, no surprise here. It's a highly advanced step sequencer capable of controlling up to 16 tracks at once, including a maximum of 8 internal monophonic audio tracks that can play back mono samples exclusively. The remaining 8 tracks are strictly MIDI tracks that can be used to control up to 8 different external instruments, including up to 8 CC parameters per MIDI track. In the case of this setup, all external instruments are hosted on the iPad. The Digitakt has unique sample processing capabilities relying on a high-resolution engine running at 48 kHz, delivering very crisp sounds with a lot of potential for uniqueness. It includes delay and reverb sound effects, as well as a master compressor, which can all be used to optionally process incoming external analog audio simultaneously with the machine's internal sound sources. The Digitakt also has a respectable song arrangement functionality known as the song mode. Just like the Digitone, it can be used as a class-compliant audio interface, which means that it can be paired via USB with an iPad in order to become its audio interface. This implies that all the sounds generated on the iPad can be sent through the Digitakt's analog output if needed. In this particular configuration, I strictly use the USB connection between my Digitakt and my iPad to transmit MIDI information. The fourth main piece of equipment I use in my setup is the Digitone. Its main description is that it's a 4-parts multi-timbral FM synthesizer with a powerful unique engine and 8 voices of polyphony. While its 4-parts multi-timbral attribute already makes it highly desirable and unique in the context of a dedicated hardware-based setup, the Digitone also includes a state-of-the-art Elektron advanced step sequencer. It also includes an arpeggiator, unison, the capability of layering parts, and a song mode. It also has 4 additional MIDI tracks to sequence external instruments, while leveraging many of the attributes unique to the Elektron sequencer. Just like the Digitakt, it can also control up to 8 CC parameters per track. In the case of this setup, all external instruments are coming from the iPad once again. It includes delay, reverb, and a highly desirable chorus effect, as well as a very powerful gain-compensated master overdrive effect, all of which can be used to optionally process incoming external analog audio simultaneously with the machine's internal sound sources. The fifth and last main piece of equipment I use in my setup is my iPhone. In this case, I use the iPhone 12 mini. It is not used to generate any sounds. Even though it technically could, it would not make sense to use it for that in the context of this setup, because the sole purpose of my iPhone in this setup is to host my custom-made remote control, which allows me to navigate through my iPad music projects without friction. More specifically, it allows me to navigate between all the main apps that I use at the tap of a button, and in the specific case of the AUM app, which is at the center of my setup, it allows me to quickly navigate to the key points that I've defined throughout my project, as well as to hide or show all the key AUV3 plugins, which I've manually chosen to associate to my remote, with the very important specificity that I can potentially show and hide multiple plugins at once just at the tap of a button, which is a complete workflow game changer. This concludes the overview of the main pieces of equipment included in my current setup. On a side note, for now I'm choosing to keep considerations related to the inclusion of my PC in all this setup mostly hidden, because otherwise the complexity of describing and explaining the setup would become too difficult to manage. Now I'll move on to the next major segment, which will cover the description and explanation of how all these elements are connected under the hood, on the software side mostly, in order to give you an idea of the fundamental structure behind my projects and to showcase the key technology elements I rely on to shape this custom setup into something cohesive that fits my needs and preferences. First, on the software side, let's start by going over the main key apps which I use as a backbone of my setup. I'll start with AUM first. AUM is essentially a revolutionary mixer app that hosts AUV3 plugins, including virtual MIDI controllers, sound generators, including synthesizers, amongst other things, sound processors, and sequencers on iPad and iPhone. AUM enables a workflow that has a level of flexibility that is unheard of in any other application to this day, including what's available on PC. Secondly, Xequence 2. Xequence is a dedicated piano roll style MIDI sequencer and arranger application with a well thought out interface with which it is also possible to record and manually write automation using a system where custom names can be associated to automated CC parameters and which can, amongst other things, also approach in some way the parameter locking functionality found in Elektron sequencers, as it makes it relatively easy to abruptly change CC parameter values as you manually write automation data. It is the most viable app I've found for this purpose, as currently it is the only dedicated app which exists on iOS that combines the ability to record and write automation in addition to the ability to manipulate blocks of MIDI for the purpose of arranging a song as you typically would in a DAW, like Ableton, for example. There are a few key things to be aware of regarding the inclusion of Xequence in this setup. It is not an AUV3, which means that it cannot be hosted in AUM, even though it communicates with it via MIDI internally. This introduces a limitation, which is that at most, Xequence can control 16 different virtual MIDI instruments in AUM, which is a limitation that would not apply for an app which would be hosted as an AUV3 in AUM directly. In practice, because I have another additional 24 tracks which I can control on my 2 Elektron machines, 12 of which I can use to control external instruments, Xequence's 16 tracks limit is never an issue for me. Because Xequence 2 is not an AUV3, only one instance of it can run at a time on an iPad. In my view, the two main advantages of Xequence being a non-hosted dedicated app are one, that it can make full use of the iPad's entire screen as it eliminates the need for plug-in UI window handles. Two, that it gives easy access to 2 full screen and highly customizable dedicated virtual MIDI controller options, which are keys and pads, while maintaining access to all the appropriate UI conveniences in that context. I suspect there are other performance advantages when it comes to stability and the display of things, but I'm just speculating here. Anyhow, in the context of being able to switch between AUM and Xequence at the tap of a button very quickly, in practice, this setup can be seen as a no-compromise full integration between the two apps. Next, the third main application I use is Audiobus. The extent to which I use Audiobus in this setup is minimal, but my setup in its current form is only possible because of the inclusion of Audiobus, and I will explain exactly why. While AUM has a built-in function to receive a command via MIDI to request the iPad to switch its focus to the AUM app, Xequence does not have this function. Audiobus adds sidebars to each of the apps that are loaded as a part of an Audiobus project, and one of the key elements of the controls included in this sidebar UI is the ability to request the iPad to switch its focus to a particular app. Additionally, another key element it enables is the ability to activate recording in an app without being focused on it. Effectively, this augments the functionality of Xequence in a critical way. Audiobus offers an in-app purchase named MIDI Learn, which enables the user to control the functions of these sidebars remotely using a MIDI controller instead, effectively enabling the user to hide these sidebars completely while retaining the benefits of the functionality contained in these sidebars. In order to fully appreciate how incredibly important this is, the key thing to understand here is how tedious, unreliable, and slow switching between apps using the iPad's gesture-based system can be. In the context of AUM in particular, considering how I rest my virtual MIDI controller against the bottom edge of my screen, like so, the last thing I want is to accidentally trigger sounds or change values by performing a gesture to switch between apps. This entire problem can only be solved at the moment by including Audiobus and its MIDI Learn optional paid feature in this setup and by using a remote control. Audiobus also enables the possibility of including other standalone apps that might not be available as AUV3s in a particular project, while also augmenting their functionality so that they can be put into focus using my iPhone remote, just like what I'm doing with Xequence. In other words, the usefulness of Audiobus can potentially expand well beyond just including Xequence in my setup. An obvious example where that would be useful is if I wanted to include the very successful standalone instrument app named Sampler without an E in my setup, which is designed around the extensive use of the touchscreen. The inclusion of Audiobus in my setup would enable me to use my iPhone remote to switch to it at the tap of a button, whereas I wouldn't have had a means to perform that action with that level of speed and reliability otherwise. A side note to consider specifically regarding the Sampler app, because of the time at which it was released and the power of iPads at the time, running Sampler as a standalone app enforced a sample buffer size that implied a level of latency that is very significantly worse than the actual optimal latency it is capable of running at. The act of requesting for the Sampler app to be loaded through Audiobus or even AUM directly through the Interapp audio protocol forces it to be aligned with the sample buffer size settings configured in Audiobus or AUM, hence dramatically improving its latency to the point where it reaches its true potential as a musical instrument. On top of the fact that AUM can be leveraged to process Sampler's main output signal. Lastly, the fourth main app, which is part of the backbone of my setup, is Surface Builder. Surface Builder is an AUV3 app which I mainly use hosted in an instance of AUM running directly on my iPhone. I specifically use Surface Builder this way because AUM is the only way to force Surface Builder to appear on screen with a portrait orientation, as opposed to the landscape orientation, which would be forced if I ran Surface Builder as a standalone app on my iPhone. Surface Builder enables users to design custom-made MIDI controllers, which in my particular use case consists exclusively of buttons that send MIDI CC signals, which are then received by both Audiobus and AUM. The only buttons on my entire remote that are dependent on Audiobus are Sequence Record, Audiobus, and Xequence. All the other buttons on my remote control communicate with AUM specifically and do things that are completely independent from Xequence and Audiobus. Additionally, there are many other benefits that inherently come with the inclusion of AUM to host Surface Builder on my iPhone in this scenario. The main benefits are 1. The reliability and compatibility of the connectivity between my iPhone and iPad by having two instances of AUM talking to each other via Wi-Fi in the context of my private network at home, which is, by the way, entirely independent from having an internet connection. And two, the second main benefit is the fact that I can save and name projects on my iPhone in AUM to match the project names I use in AUM on my iPad to keep the action of loading any project intuitive. Doing this eliminates the need for constantly saving new Surface Builder templates, which could turn into an unnecessary mess, as I often modify some of the names of the buttons on my remote control to adapt to the changes I make to the virtual instruments I use throughout my projects. Surface Builder is also potentially extremely useful for other use cases directly on my iPad, but I'll stop here for now. That concludes the general description of the main apps that are at the core of my setup. Now let's move on to the next major segment, which is the description of the routing and logistics behind the core elements in my setup. The purpose of this section is to give you a general idea of how the persistent elements in my projects are interconnected. Generally speaking, I consider this setup to be fairly advanced in many ways because of the amount of elements involved. So in my opinion, it's not exactly beginner friendly, even though inherently this setup has the possibility to be as simple or as complex as you would want it to be for your own potential use case. First, let's focus on AUM. The first thing to understand is that in order to be able to control AUM with my iPhone remote, a specific type of connection between the iPhone and the iPad has to be made. The MIDI connection technology I use to connect the two is referred to in AUM simply as network session. Once this connection is made, the press of a button on my iPhone sends MIDI CC data to AUM on my iPad through Wi-Fi as opposed to Bluetooth. From that point on, once the relevant connections are made in AUM's settings, I can create the appropriate associations between my remote control buttons and instruments loaded in AUM by using the MIDI Learn functionality. This allows me to show key elements in my project at the tap of a button. The size and position of each plugin UI window have to be adjusted once to establish how they should be displayed in AUM according to your preferences moving forward. And once that is set, moving or resizing UI plugin windows most likely won't be needed again for that particular project. A key thing to understand here is that this function allows you to assign multiple plugins to the same remote control button, even though a particular plugin can only be assigned to one MIDI CC value at a time. This means that you can open up multiple plugin UI windows at once by tapping just one button, which is incredibly powerful from a customization standpoint. And this is what I've been doing since the beginning here by doing those and basically flexing those four all at once. On a side note, while I could technically modify some buttons on my remote control to enable specific buttons to send multiple CC values at once, which implies that some CC values would have the potential to be used by different buttons at the same time, I haven't found a major incentive to want to do that because in AUM, a particular plugin instance UI window can only have one size and position at a time anyway. Additionally, attempting this kind of stunt would mean that I would also no longer be able to rely on MIDI Learn in AUM to create associations between buttons and plugin controls, as the MIDI Learn function in AUM is designed to only receive one MIDI CC signal at a time. It would technically still be possible to configure the appropriate information manually to create the relevant associations though. If eventually it became possible to save and show a custom snapshot of the entirety of what's displayed on screen at once in AUM, it would mean that it could be interesting to have multiple remote control buttons pointing to the same plugin instance. But according to my understanding, such a functionality would have to be implemented in AUM in a way which would make the need for defining the same CC value for different buttons on my remote control probably unnecessary to begin with. Now, to continue further with AUM connection logistics, I'll explain how I connect virtual MIDI controllers in AUM with the appropriate instrument tracks and how I route that MIDI data to enable MIDI recording in Xequence in parallel, which might be a bit of a challenge to understand considering the complexity of this setup, but my explanation should be digestible enough. At the root of my AUM project templates, I have a section which I think of as my controller section. A requirement of my setup is that it must enable me to record MIDI data to Xequence using my touchscreen directly while my iPad is focused on AUM. The reason for this is because I want to ensure that I can remain spontaneous if I want to capture a particular idea that I'm jamming with as I'm tweaking a synth plugin. I also want to be able to do this without depending on an external physical keyboard controller, because the iPad Pro's touchscreen is sufficiently responsive for my MIDI data input needs, and this allows me to keep my setup much more compact and comfortable. Using virtual MIDI controllers also enables me to use MIDI control surfaces that are much more flexible than just a typical piano-style keyboard. A good example of this would be the inclusion of an isomorphic control surface, which profoundly changes the way people input MIDI data on a MIDI controller. On a technical level, this implies that I need to have the means of changing the MIDI channel that my virtual keyboard controller is sending MIDI data to, and that I have to be able to do this in a convenient way that introduces as little friction as possible. By using the word convenient, I mean specifically that the MIDI channel selection mechanism I want to use for that task has to include a naming system that eliminates the need for me to remember precisely what instrument is associated to what MIDI channel number. The best way that I found to accomplish this is to introduce an intermediate app between my virtual MIDI keyboard output and the intended destination, which in this case is both virtual instruments and sequencers. The best app I've identified to accomplish that task is Helium, even though Helium is not intended to be used in this context. Helium is a lightweight, feature-rich, full-on piano roll style MIDI sequencer that runs as an AUV3 directly in my AUM project. In my particular setup, Helium does three key things. The first thing is that it connects via MIDI with all the instruments hosted in AUM that I've chosen to associate with Helium, and it gives me the key ability to redirect the MIDI signal coming from my keyboard controller towards the MIDI channel corresponding to the track that I choose to put into focus in Helium. Effectively, this capability makes Helium a very powerful and flexible MIDI channel selector for my keyboard controller, but this idea can be used for other virtual MIDI devices as well. Many AUV3 MIDI controller apps on iOS only have the capability of sending MIDI through channel 1, which means that in order to preserve full flexibility in terms of routing MIDI data throughout a complex AUM project, an intermediate app needs to be involved. Helium provides functionality that enables users to assign a custom name to each MIDI track connected with Helium. Additionally, Helium's mixer page, which is what you see right now, allows users to clearly see the custom names defined for any of the 16 tracks it can send MIDI to. Using Helium's mixer page and tapping on the name of a particular track visible on that mixer page effectively switches the focus of the MIDI track that Helium is looking at, which essentially changes the MIDI channel through which my MIDI keyboard controller connected to Helium is sending data. So I can briefly demonstrate this now. So even though you see that currently 5 tracks have names, I only have 3 objects that are routed at the moment. So the first one is BA1. The second one is rings. And the last one is actually Bliss Omega, even though it says rings here. And so that demonstrates how I can super easily switch between instruments. And so how did I bring this entire app up? Just the tap of a button. So if I do it again here, you see that it's persistent when you close and open it. So for the rest of my project, if I want to really heavily start to change instrument focus, all it takes is 2 taps. One to open it. Oh, hold on. One to open it, one to switch, and then I'm already good to go. Technically, you could argue, hey, one more for minimizing the thing, but who cares? The second key thing that Helium does is that in parallel with what I've just explained, Helium allows the MIDI data coming from my virtual MIDI keyboard on MIDI channel 1 to simply pass through Helium and to be sent to Xequence on channel 1. Then on Xequence's end, I've configured the incoming MIDI data signal so that it can be recorded to the MIDI track, which I've chosen to put into focus in Xequence. This particular aspect of my setup is routed in such a way where there is no problem of a potential MIDI loop whatsoever. So here, let's say I want to do it for BA1, which is the track variant B. As you can see, this one is routed, and right now it's in focus. So if I go back to AUM, and put my focus on that same track, I can effectively press the record button on my remote here, and it's going to start writing stuff in Xequence. So I can show this briefly. And right there, as you can see. If I want to control instruments hosted in AUM from Xequence's interface directly, I can simply go in Xequence's dedicated virtual MIDI controller page and input MIDI data from there as an alternative to what I can do when my iPad's focus is on AUM. The third key thing that Helium enables me to do in this particular configuration is to use its sequencer to directly record the MIDI output of apps that do generative MIDI stuff, such as TAIP. And Helium allows me to look at this recorded output and to potentially modify it directly in AUM without the need to commit to recording that MIDI data on a dedicated track in Xequence. That recorded output, which has the inherent attribute of being 100% consistent in terms of its content, can of course always be sent in real time to Xequence to be recorded. I can demonstrate this here. Just want to keep my setup as stripped down as possible. So this is TAIP, and TAIP controls the one instance of BA1 that I have running in this project. Just to be sure you understand what sound it's controlling, this is the sound in question. Okay, so this application is a generative MIDI app that randomly sends MIDI note, well, not randomly, but it generates content which it sends to BA1 in order to control it. And this instance of Helium, which I'm using, is entirely dedicated to potentially recording it. So if I press play, and if I go ahead and record, specifically inside Helium, it will start to record notes. Okay, so it was there. Okay. I thought all this stuff I've done before was gone. So now what I've done in Helium, I just disengaged TAIP, but it's recorded now. And from that point on, it's consistent if I want to export it. Helium is a very powerful sequencer, and so the way in which I'm choosing to use it in my setup represents a tiny fraction of what it can actually be used for. Now, to continue further with the third and last part of this setup routing logistics section, I will now go over the logistics and MIDI connections of AUM's virtual instruments tracks as it relates to my hardware sequencers, my software sequencers, and my virtual MIDI controllers. So aside from the fact that I've already configured AUM to send MIDI clock to my Elektron machines via USB, the connection between my hardware sequencers and my tracks goes as follows. On my Elektron machines directly, when I select a MIDI track, I have the option of choosing what MIDI channel it will send its MIDI data to. So as you can see here, for track 14, I've set it up to send data to channel 9. Concurrently, on AUM's side, for a given instrument track, I simply enable the appropriate input connection in order to connect the instrument to the relevant Elektron machine. And I also systematically apply a MIDI input filter so that the AUM instrument track can only see MIDI data coming from the intended MIDI channel. As a general guideline, this practice is extremely important considering the involvement of Xequence in this setup because it is external to AUM. This puts pressure on the overall routing with regards to the necessity of ensuring that the MIDI data that reaches each track is properly filtered. For every Elektron machine MIDI track I use in my setup, I will systematically cherry pick and assign 8 MIDI CC parameters to control a particular track, instrument, or its associated effects remotely. I do this mainly to leverage Elektron's parameter locking and MIDI modulation capabilities. I will choose between either custom mapped CC controls, which I've defined in AUM manually, or I can choose CC controls that directly correspond to pre-mapped parameters defined by the developer of a particular app I happen to be using. For example, I could choose an effects send node as I'm sequencing a particular track on my Digitakt, and this particular effects send node is a control that actually is a part of AUM directly, as opposed to being an element that belongs to a third-party AUV3 plugin. despite the fact that the third-party plugin in question is the main subject that I'm controlling on a particular Digitakt MIDI track. In my case, the biggest example I can use to showcase the amazing flexibility that the inclusion of both types of controls enables is the particular MIDI CC control mapping I'm using on my Digitakt to control Ruismaker FM. I will demonstrate this briefly here. So I will pick a track that I don't use. So in this case, track 14. So that track is mapped to a sound, but I just don't have any data in it. So that's the sound it corresponds to. And so out of all the 8 controls that are mapped on my Digitakt to control that sound, 2 of them are actually not related to the sound generator itself. 2 nodes here are, well, 2 controls here are connected to send effect nodes that belong to AUM. So for example, so now that was the delay. I completely cut it off, and this one is the reverb, and that's the sound without those nodes. So to show you what I mean exactly here, so I'll talk about this later. Okay. So this right here is the sound in question. And if you can see, if I turn this knob, you can see that it's adding stuff for the delay node. And so, as you can see, that's an object that belongs to AUM and not Ruismaker FM, which is the instrument that I'm controlling. So now, let's say I want to control the decay of that track. That belongs to Ruismaker. Even if this setup is very powerful, it's not perfect by any means because 1, it requires the discipline of remembering what actual parameters are controlled via MIDI CC by the knobs that are assigned on the Elektron machines. And ultimately, the only way to manage this reliably is to take notes to minimize the issue. I also tend to spend a lot of time with a particular project template, so I naturally become very familiar with the parameters I'm controlling. Additionally, there's typically redundancy if I use the same instrument on more than one track, which is the case in this example where I use Ruismaker FM on 6 tracks on my Digitakt. On a side note, the Digitakt 2 largely eliminates this problem by making it possible to name the parameters it controls on top of allowing up to 16 parameters to be controlled per track instead of 8 on the Digitakt and Digitone currently. Secondly, this setup is also not perfect because the transmission of MIDI CC data in this context is not bidirectional. The implication here is that in order to keep RFM perfectly synchronized in terms of what parameter values are shown on my Digitakt versus what parameter values are shown on my iPad in Ruismaker FM's UI directly, I have to refrain from touching the parameters that are controlled by the Digitakt on my iPad touchscreen, which is not difficult in my experience, but still requires user awareness. So just to be extra clear here, all the parameters which I've mapped at the moment, I know which ones they are. So for example, I know that I haven't mapped the panning in here. So I'm free to mess around with the panning as I please. And I know that it will never cause the 2 locations to go out of sync. So yeah, that's pretty much what I mean. But because, for example, the decay is mapped on the Digitone, I will make sure never to fiddle with it on that part of the system, let's say. Lastly, there are no guarantees that the parameter locking capabilities of the Elektron sequencers will be fully compatible with every AUV3 plugin that ends up being controlled by these machines. For example, while I found that using the Elektron sequencer's parameter locking functionality works mostly flawlessly with Ruismaker Noir and Rings Effects, which is a plugin based on the Mutable Instruments Rings module, parameter locking actually does not work flawlessly with Ruismaker FM, even though it still works. And while I still can make great use of that plugin, I have to be mindful of this when I program a sequence on my Digitakt. Different plugins will have a different level of performance, but there definitely are viable solutions available. Now on to the next section of this segment, which will be about connecting virtual instruments tracks to software sequencers. So because I want to be able to trigger basically every sound in my project with a virtual MIDI keyboard controller in AUM, the implication is that all my virtual instrument tracks are connected to my main instance of Helium, which is the instance that acts as my MIDI selector. Once again, this type of connection makes it mandatory to enable the proper MIDI input filtering condition in AUM in order to ensure that triggering MIDI at the source ends up sending MIDI data to the intended instrument. This effectively means that even if I'm sequencing AUV3 synths on my Digitakt or Digitone, for example, I will still put the necessary routing in place to also be able to trigger these sounds with my MIDI keyboard in parallel, even if I don't necessarily intend to sequence these sounds in Xequence, for example. Now, specifically with regards to Xequence, for each AUM instrument track I want to control with Xequence, I activate the option AUM destination in the list of MIDI inputs for a given AUM track, and I ensure that the proper filtering condition is enabled for that particular track. And now I will discuss how my virtual MIDI controllers are connected in this setup. So simply put, I use one instance of AU keys, which I connect to the instance of Helium that acts as my MIDI channel selector, as I've explained before. That means that at no point is there ever a direct connection between my virtual MIDI keyboard controllers and the instruments that they effectively end up controlling. One of the major advantages of this is simply a matter of flexibility. I don't have to use a separate instance of a controller for each instrument I want to control. I can swap a MIDI controller for another one, depending on my needs, and simply connect the new one to Helium's MIDI input, or I can even choose to run multiple controllers at once without ever needing to go back in each track settings to reassociate a controller to an instrument track. Again, this is the whole point of including a convenient MIDI channel selector such as Helium in this setup in the first place. In parallel to this, I also use a separate instance of AU keys to control my Digitone, specifically because it can be played polyphonically, which makes it generally more interesting to play with a keyboard compared to the Digitakt. Whatever track I select on my Digitone is going to be the track that will receive MIDI from that particular instance of AU keys. I chose to give it a different color as well. Right there. And I also made it larger, just to eliminate the possibility of confusion as to which keyboard is routed to what. So for instance, at the moment, on my Digitakt. Let's say now I put the focus on the pads track. Okay, so that's pretty self-explanatory. Let's say I go for like a snappier sound, maybe this one. You can see it's snappy enough as well, but it's not the snappiest, but it's definitely functional. Now let's move on to the fourth and last main section of this video, which should be pretty much a piece of cake considering what's been covered up to this point. In this last major segment, I will go over the audio routing for the main components of this setup. So I'll start by going over the Digitakt and the Digitone, and I'll explain how they're connected with one another, as well as with the rest of my project in AUM. There's a combination of key things to be aware of to begin with in this area, and bear with me here because the rabbit hole goes quite deep. The first thing is the fact that the iPad Pro on its own doesn't have any means of outputting an analog audio signal through a typical stereo jack without connecting another piece of equipment to it. If, in order to address this, I was to simply connect Apple's USB-C to stereo jack $10 adapter to my iPad, for example, I would then run into multiple issues because the single connection point on my iPad Pro would then be occupied, which would make it impossible for me to expand its connectivity to fit my needs. The key things which I absolutely need to be able to do include 1. The ability to charge my iPad while I'm using it to make music, 2. The ability to connect my iPad with the rest of my equipment, and 3. The ability to get a high quality analog audio output from the iPad. Already, this means that there's an opportunity here to control the quality of the conversion process that will transform the iPad's digital output through its USB 4.0 port into a usable analog audio output, which can then be monitored and potentially recorded externally. So in this setup, I leverage the fact that I already have an Elektron machine which has high quality converters in order to accomplish conversion duties, but the implications absolutely don't end there. In the case of my setup, because the machine which I end up using for that conversion process also doubles as a class compliant USB audio interface as well as an electronic music instrument of its own, this gives me the opportunity to basically tell my Digitone not to pass its own internal synth engine digital output through its own analog output, and to instead have that digital signal be routed via USB into my iPad in AUM. This then enables me to use all of my AUV3 plugins in AUM to process my Digitone's signal extensively with very low latency latencycycycy which makes this whole setup totally viable for live applications, by the way. So if I briefly demonstrate this here. Okay, so as you can see, this is very responsive. Okay, but this signal, which originates from the Digitone, actually went through a FabFilter Pro Q3 EQ, FabFilter Pro C2 compressor, a shaper, and then that signal was routed to my main out FX chain, which also includes 2 more compressors one Volcano instance, one tape. And so if you do the sum of all that stuff and you consider how responsive this is, as you can see, this is 100% viable for live. Ultimately, because I've configured the Digitone so that the iPad is in full control of the Digitone's own analog outputs, which in other words means that my Digitone is my iPad's audio interface, this allows me to output the entire audio of an AUM project through the Digitone's analog output, which now also include the processed audio signal of the Digitone's own synth engines as well, which is what I just demonstrated earlier. What makes this so incredibly powerful is not only the fact that this routing makes it possible to bypass the digital to analog conversion process of sending the Digitone's audio output to the iPad, as well as sending AUM's digital audio signal from the iPad back to the Digitone, but also the fact that it's possible to do all this while avoiding the need to invest in a dedicated audio interface, which makes the efficiency of purchasing an Elektron machine in that context completely skyrocket. The obvious question at this point is, where does the Digitakt fit in all this? So on a technical level, the Digitakt could absolutely replace the Digitone for the application I just described. But because I want to be able to process my Digitakt's analog audio output through my Digitone's chorus and master overdrive effects especially, which is a subject I've covered extensively in my previous video, what ends up happening is that I simply connect my Digitakt's analog stereo output to my Digitone's analog stereo input. The implication here is that the signal my iPad receives in AUM is the sum of my Digitakt's and Digitone's audio outputs, and throughout this entire chain, only high-quality conversion took place. A completely understandable objection to the routing I just described is obviously the lack of flexibility that this implies, and I have two things to answer to that. If you feel the need for it, you can always invest in a dedicated multi-input, high-quality, class-compliant USB audio interface, such as the RME UCX2, as it would enable you to process the Digitakt's signal in AUM separately from the Digitone's signal, but you would lose the unique ability to process the Digitakt's through the Digitone's effects, even though this is no longer really a consideration if you have the new Digitakt 2, as the updated model includes a master overdrive and a chorus as well. The second point is that in practice, I simply don't feel the limitation because there is much less pressure on my Elektron machines purely as sound sources, because I also want to involve all the sonic possibilities that come directly from the high quality AUV3 plugins I carefully selected on the iPad. Let's move to the next subject of this section, which will cover details related to AUM's main output track, grouped tracks routings, and send effect buses. AUM gives incredible flexibility when it comes to being able to redirect audio and processing it in creative ways. An example of how I do this is by routing a group of relevant tracks towards another track, which can then be seen as a grouped track, and then I'll add relevant processing to the grouped track. I will then send the processed grouped track output to my main output track, where it will be merged with the rest of my project's tracks. In this process, the grouped track will also effectively get processed by the plugins that are loaded on my main output track effects chain. An example of how I do this is by routing a group of relevant tracks towards another track, which can be seen as a grouped track. And then I'll add relevant processing to the grouped track. I will then send the processed grouped track output to my main output track, where it will be merged with the rest of my project's track, or tracks, rather. In this process, the grouped track will also effectively get processed by the plugins that are loaded on my main output track effects chain. This is something I use for one of the 2 instances of Roosmaker FM I have in this project, where I group all 6 tracks into another, which I happen to call Noir Sum, where I can apply a compressor and a transient effect plugin called Phosphat. In parallel to all this, I also rely on 3 sound effect buses, where one is dedicated to delay, another one to reverb, and the last one to chorusing. I even go as far as to enable some effect buses to also send their output to other effects buses, which in this case I demonstrate with the delay and chorus buses. So I'll show you what I mean exactly here. So here's the Noir Sum track, which actually is the sum of 7 tracks. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And as you can see at the bottom of all these 7 tracks, there's a kind of light blue colored node, and that node corresponds to the group track. And so all these 7 tracks are rerouted completely in there, and then it gets processed by a compressor and then Phosphat. But throughout this entire process, all of these tracks are sending their signal to my send effect buses. So as you can see here, reverb, delay, chorus, and they all have their own settings. And in the grouped track, I've chosen not to add like sound effects nodes because I felt like it would be redundant, or I didn't feel like I needed that. Now, here are the 3 sound effect buses. And as you can see here, the delay bus sends its signal into the chorus bus as well, and as well as the reverb. And the chorus also sends a bit of its signal into the reverb as well. So hopefully by now you're starting to get a sense of the incredible possibilities that this setup enables. I will now discuss the last subject of this section, which is considerations related to latency, performance, and overheating. So first, I'll start with the latency considerations. If you want to do like real-time recording, like real-time playing, it's very important that you make sure that all the elements that are included in your project are compatible with that goal. And so a very powerful way of ensuring that you're in control and that you understand the latencies that are involved in your project is to go into AUM's latency monitoring tool. And so in this case, you can see I'm running at 48 kilohertz. My buffer size is 128 samples. My buffer duration is 2.67 milliseconds. That's extremely fast. Now it's telling me information about my round trip latency. And I can get very detailed information. So for instance, here this focuses on DSP load, which is, which is useful to show the percentage used by each element relatively to the other ones, but it doesn't really show you the real tax that it puts onto the system. If you want to know the real tax, while this location is interesting, in my opinion, the best location which I've found in the entire tool to help me understand and assess how heavy certain items are is the time tab, because it gives you microseconds as a reference, so that you can compare what nodes or instruments are very lightweight versus the ones that are very costly. So something that would be very costly would be in the ballpark of 500 to 600 microseconds. Whereas, as you can see, in my entire setup, there isn't a single thing that's really past 100 microseconds. So this is an extremely lightweight, extremely efficient setup. And so, as a result of this setup is extremely stable, even in a situation where the room temperature would be really hot, which is kind of is the case for me right now. And I'm at no point, like, the monitor here says that I'm only using 35% of my DSP, which is, it's not really representative of a problem. It's more about the kind of instruments that you choose to put in your setup, because you can stack a lot of certain things and never run into an issue. Whereas if you add other types of things, such as like ultra heavy synthesizers, it can really push you over the edge. So you need to be very careful about that stuff. And ultimately, if there isn't so much pressure, according to your preferences, to be able to trigger sounds with like very low latency, you can always increase the buffer size from 128 to 256. I think that's the only jump that's it's a jump straight from 128 to 256, and that will significantly alleviate the load on the system, and you will then be able to make a project that's a lot heavier. Right now in this project, I'm probably using, I would say, about maybe like somewhere between 50 to 60% to what I could put in it, but I would still have to be very, very careful with what I add, especially if I want to add heavy elements to it. So to continue on, AUM also has extreme flexibility and offers high precision adjustment for offsetting sync, whether it's related to Ableton Link, which I use to sync Xequence, AUM, and my PC, or simply for MIDI clock. So the way that I would access it is over here. And here, for example, as you can see, you have the Ableton Link option, and you have an Ableton Link offset, and you have, in milliseconds, you have 1/10 of a millisecond that you can make an adjustment over. So it's extremely precise. And as far as the clock, which I use, you have an offset in milliseconds, but you can also adjust to 1/10 of a millisecond as well. So it's incredible, essentially. I also wanted to discuss TAIP in particular, because that's an incredibly powerful part of my setup. So while, yes, TAIP is a tape emulation plugin, the main reason as to why it's so desirable is because it serves the function of a limiter, and it allows me to push the volume of my project well beyond what I could normally do if I didn't introduce this processor in the system. And the thing is, as opposed to FabFilter's Pro L2 limiter, which I also have, the latency that it introduces is negligible. So in other words, it serves the function of a limiter, which despite its use would be very detrimental to latency, and it just introduces basically no latency. And this is what you can confirm here, or what I can demonstrate rather. I'll go in time. As you can see, 105 milliseconds, well, that's the processing wait, but the latency that it introduces, you can see 1.3 millisecond, which is ridiculously good. In the best possible FabFilter Pro L2 configuration that I could get using the transparent mode, at best I would get like 12 milliseconds, and at worst I would get like 25 milliseconds. So to me, this is pretty much the most important processor out of my entire studio by far, because the kinds of volumes I can get directly from my like real-time project is just incredible, and again without latency. So if I give you just a quick demonstration of volume, just to give you an idea, this might like interfere a bit with YouTube because of the LUFS limitations, but none of this will ever clip, and I can show you how loud it can get. So I'm adding stuff. Okay. Just make it kind of heavy enough. Okay. So now I'll push it. And that's the max. As you can see, it's never clipping. So that pretty much covers the whole subject of tape. I wanted to demonstrate what I meant at the beginning of the presentation about cores. As you can see, I have 8 cores on my iPad, and only 4 out of the 8 are reporting activity. So the next part I think I've already kind of touched on briefly, the sustainable sample buffer size depending on your project design choices. So the highest buffer that you could really realistically expect to have to downgrade to, in my opinion, is probably going to be 256 samples, and that's already like clearly a viable setup. But one thing's for sure is that it's relatively easy to hit the limit of sustainability of a setup running at 128 samples if you include heavy synthesizers, even though they're super efficient, but they're still heavy, and there's a pretty clear limit to how many of them you can run without pushing the CPU into a cadence, let's say, that's going to inevitably cause it to overheat. And because the iPad is a fanless design, this is something that you need to be very careful with, because the last thing you want is your whole music session to be disturbed or disrupted by having like some major audio failure happening. And so this is something that's really important to be mindful of. And so this concludes the last segment. If you've managed to have the patience to make it this far, once again, you're an absolute legend. This was definitely the kind of video I hope I'm only ever going to have to make once, because even though it's potentially extremely useful for some people, articulating this kind of information is a highly time-consuming, dry, and tedious process, which is not exactly fun. But I thought it was worth the energy investment considering the content I plan on making on this channel. I sincerely hope the video was useful to you and that it potentially even inspired you to consider a similar setup. If you've enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to my channel. It would really help the growth of this channel and encourage me to create more content. In my upcoming videos, I will definitely shift my focus towards actually using the tools, which will make the content much more approachable and enjoyable to watch. That's it for now. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.